Thank you, Bill, for that welcome, and good morning, everyone. I bring greetings from Secretary Napolitano, and hope to explain to you her vision of security and foreign policy in a way that resonates with good, constructive, continued achievements between our countries going forward. It was a pleasure to be at the Security Technology Alliance dinner last night to see old friends and to make some new ones. Secretary Napolitano likes to speak in this 10th year of Homeland Security of being in Homeland Security 2.0 on the way to 3.0. 1.0 was in the aftermath of 9/11, in which the United States understood for the first time, really, because we were a little bit spoiled by geography, not as much as you've been, but a little bit spoiled by geography by having the Atlantic and the Pacific between us and potential enemies, with land borders after wars in the 19th century with Mexico and with Canada. We do have the longest demilitarized borders in the world with those two countries. But in fact, 9/11 was the trauma that leads friends, such good friends of America as your Ambassador Mike Moore saying, you have to understand something about these Americans, that security trumps everything. And what I want to do this morning, and perhaps set the scene for the distinguished panel that follows, is discuss why that is not antithetical to making trade work. In fact, the proposition I hope to persuade you of is that security and facilitating lawful trade is actually the same process. We've traditionally seen it as requiring balance, as being mutually exclusive factors, that when we want more security, by definition, we have to slow down the trade so that people can inspect it and look at it and open the containers. I want to suggest to you and persuade you this morning that that's an anachronistic, old-fashioned way of seeing the relationship between trade and security, and therefore between security and foreign policy. So we actually used to look at borders as lines on a map, the juridical demarcations between countries, and to see our ports of entry, 330 of them, seaports, airports, and land ports in the United States, as being the first line of defense, that was where we inspected cargo, inspected people, intended to keep our enemies away, but it was at the borders, the land, sea, and airport aviation borders, that we saw as the mark. What we discovered after 9/11 is that in a global world, in fact, you have to look at borders not as lines on a map or on the sand, but rather in a world in which the flows of goods, people, ideas, images, electrons is constant and ever-changing, that in fact we look at borders as being flows of goods and people toward the homeland. Flows of goods and people on a massive scale. Every day in the United States, we clear 1 million people into the country. 270,000 privately occupied vehicles cross our Canadian and Mexican borders. 60,000 trailers, containers on trailers, on airplanes, and on maritime vessels come into the country. Massive flows of goods and people. And it's changed the way we see the function of Homeland Security. So it will probably surprise some of you to learn that the Department of Homeland Security, now the third largest department with 240,000 employees, formed in 10 years by basically smushing, as we say, that technical term, taking 22 separate agencies from around the American government, putting them together and giving them the mission to protect the homeland. We never really thought about the homeland in the United States because of the sea and the fortress America notion that became anachronistic. And security does trump because it was on 9/11 that we had the first time that the continental United States had been invaded since the British burned Washington 100 years ago in the War of 1812. But by looking at Homeland Security as keeping dangerous people and dangerous things away from the American homeland, we really began to understand that Homeland Security is intrinsically international. So Homeland Security, in addition to being the third largest department, has the third largest footprint abroad. The job being to secure goods and people as they come toward the homeland, and to do that from abroad, to actually engage with our foreign allies and friends to do as much as we can do to secure the flow of goods before they get to the borders, and to do it as early in time before they arrive there, so that we begin to see the borders and the ports of entry not as the first line of defense, but the last line of defense. Two incidents brought that home to us in the aftermath of 9/11. One was Christmas Day 2010, when Abdul Muttalib, a Nigerian, got on a plane in Africa, flew to Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and then boarded a Northwest Airlines flight and intended to detonate himself in the airplane over Detroit. When he attempted to do so, he was actually over Canada and was foiled in that. And the interesting thing was, we had developed a security regime that would have looked at him and had identified him as someone we were going to examine in secondary in the Detroit airport. But then we realized that, of course, we would have been too late, and the terrorist act would have been accomplished, so that we basically had to redo the concept of airport and passenger security by doing it before people got on those last point of departures in Schiphol. Schiphol became the border of the United States for purposes of protecting the homeland. And we've restructured the way we do aviation security in that year, since that time. 1 year later, you may recall the Yemen cargo plot, in which al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula put explosives onto the two cargo planes, intending to detonate them over Chicago. With Saudi intelligence help, we were able to cooperate with foreign partners, both in the private sector and in the public sector, and take those two offending packages out of a supply chain of millions of packages. Again, these packages were addressed to a synagogue in Chicago. Again, Customs and Border Protection, which I was heading at that time, would have looked at those packages when they arrived in Chicago, but again, it would have been too late. So the point is that in a global world with flows of goods and people, in which transnational criminals, including terrorists, operate in the seams, you actually have to go out and you have to secure the flow way before they arrive at your borders. And to do that is what we have introduced as Homeland Security 3.0, which is an international dimension to this, a foreign policy dimension to Homeland Security that is very important. So what is if the job is to keep dangerous people and dangerous things away by securing the flows, recognizing that 98+% or 99% of the flow of people and goods is perfectly legitimate, how do you find the needle in a haystack? Two ways to find a needle in a haystack, actually three ways. The first we tried after 9/11. In the aftermath of 9/11, we opened up every trunk coming from Canada and coming from Mexico. The lines stretched back 10 miles south into Mexico and north into Canada, opening up every trunk to look into every vehicle. Became clear that you cannot look at every straw in the haystack and expect to find the needle, so we abandoned that as Homeland Security 1.0. Then we introduced a notion of threat assessment, risk management, and traffic segmentation. And here's the key to why security and and trade facilitation are actually the same process, not mutually exclusive, requiring to be balanced. Because the second way in which you can actually find the needle in a haystack is you get very specific intelligence information of the kind we got from the Saudis that day in October 2010, and you can reach into the haystack and you can pluck out the needle. And while intelligence and the sharing of intelligence is getting better, that is not the most reliable way day by day in the operation of your businesses or security regimes to actually find the needle in a haystack. The most reliable way of doing that routinely is to make the haystack smaller. And you make the haystack smaller in the context of trade of passengers and cargo by learning as much as you can about the cargo and about the passengers, and expediting those that do not present a high risk, and concentrating your energy and your scarce inspectional resources on that portion of the cargo flow or the passenger flow about which you have derogatory information or about which you lack sufficient information to reach a judgment that it is sufficiently low risk to be able to let it pass without careful inspection. That is the way in which we now operate trade in the United States, and I will end the talk this morning in a few minutes by showing how actually New Zealand and the United States have pioneered this in an interesting sort of historic fashion. But the notion of security and trade facilitation being the same is true, because by expediting lawful trade and traffic, following the 70-30 principle or the 90-10 principle, spending 90% of your time on the 10% of the passengers or the cargo about which you do not have an assurance of low risk, permits you to actually raise your security profile at any particular resource allocation level. It's an insight which now drives much of the way in which the United States analyzes $2 trillion in imports, and increasingly, with regard to counterproliferation concerns, $1.9 trillion in exports. In order to implement that, one requires having as many people as we do, Customs and Border Protection people abroad, working with New Zealand Customs, for example, or with customs officials all over the world. Because the other lesson of this new change that globalization has brought to the way in which we see security has to do with information sharing. And we are just at the threshold of this, and New Zealand and the United States have started something that I think 10 to 15 years from now will be standard in the way in which global supply chains and global travel and transit zones are managed. So do you remember when you were growing up, you learned from your mother or your father or your earliest teacher that information is power? And information is power. But the traditional lesson that we drew from that was that we hoarded the information. We did not share it on the assumption that if we kept the information to ourselves, we could extract something from he or she who wanted to get the information from us, and that we could benefit from that information by dribbling it out. I submit to you in a global, digital, instantaneous transmission world, the lesson is to the contrary. That in fact there is so much information, so much data. In order to make usable information out of that data, you are best advised to share it. And by sharing data with someone, you get to learn something about the data you have, and the information becomes more useful and more actionable. He who hoards information today will soon be isolated and ignored. You increase your power by sharing information. And that's the theory that also facilitates the notion of give as much information as we can about passengers and cargo, so that we can make, and with our partners, judgments about how fast we can move them through ports of entry. New Zealand, and you would say, why wouldn't any country want to know when a sex offender gets on a plane in New York and is heading to London? Why wouldn't the Brits want to know that offender is actually en route toward the United Kingdom? The fact of the matter is there is very little information sharing routinely between countries having to do with criminal history or criminal information. Agents and officers share information based on cases, but they do not take advantage of the way in which we can do computerized federated searches today that completely respect privacy and only alert on known threats or unknown threats. The only two countries that have actually made this happen are New Zealand and the United States. When you hosted the World Cup, and I was delighted to see you prevailed. Martin Dunn, then the Customs Commissioner, supported by his worthy and able successor, my friend Carolyn Tremaine, asked if it would be possible, since there were going to be hundreds of thousands of people coming toward New Zealand that New Zealand knew nothing about, whether or not we could arrange a way in which New Zealand could run those manifests against a variety of databases that the United States had compiled, in addition to the information that has been compiled by the New Zealand government. So for the first time, we actually had a system in which those manifests were compared to databases, and the only information that was preserved or shared, in fact, was where there was a match. And as a result of that, and you say, doesn't it strike you as odd that that instance is the only routinized instance we have in the world among the greatest of friends that actually shares information that way? And there are a variety of reasons for that, including, from my perspective, misplaced notions of privacy. And I should hasten to say to my New Zealand friends, my Kiwi friends, what I say to my Canadian friends who say, well, you Americans are not interested in privacy. Dear friends, we invented privacy. We invented it with a law review article by Louis Brandeis in the late 19th century, having to do with paparazzi back before the 20th century turned. We care deeply about privacy, but we think that when you get into a global supply chain or a global transit zone, that you have given consent to information being shared. And now we're not talking about information sharing in the old sense. So when we entered into this arrangement with Carolyn Tremaine and her colleagues at Customs, it was not the old bulk data sharing. This was not about, I take all of my data about all of my citizens and I back it up and I dump it into a New Zealand database, or vice versa. These are federated computer searches that permit search engines to scan through a variety of databases, and the only thing that comes out that is not entirely masked is the match. And then you have a series of protocols that protects the privacy of that information, where the match is not one that requires law enforcement or other action. We intend, with the cooperation of New Zealand authorities, to continue to pioneer these kinds of things, because we rely on New Zealand to do it in a sensible way that serves both countries' interests but respects the core values of each of the societies. So as we go forward and as we look at security and foreign policy, I ask you to look at security as not being antithetical to trade. Your wise ambassador is right. Security trumps, but if it trumps properly, it also means that we expedite trusted trade and trusted travel. And in fact, let me end by pitching global entry. For those of you who travel to the United States more than 3 or 4 times a year, 3 or more times a year, unless you enjoy waiting on long lines at Dulles or at JFK in New York or at LAX in Los Angeles, please look at the possibility of us extending the global entry system, which actually is an application of what I've talked about. If you are a trusted traveler, you get vetted, you answer questions, and in exchange for exchanging the information which remains private, you actually then have an expedited passage through American airports without waiting. We are doing reciprocal programs with SmartGate, having American who turn up in Wellington or Auckland to be able to move through New Zealand immigration. We need to close that agreement, and we need to move forward with in this front as we have in the others. So in closing, security and trade facilitation are the same process. Please work that into the DNA of your business process. Provide information in advance. Insist that the government conduct a risk assessment. Be prepared to make that case, and we will continue to see the growth in trade, in expedited trade between New Zealand and the United States that exists. Welcome to our country. Thank you for your friendship, your alliance, your good sense, and your unending sense of humor. Thank you.
Thanks. We have time for just a couple of questions before the Assistant Secretary leaves. Anyone? Yes.
Simon Leeming, Honorary Consul, Boston. What are the lessons of Boston?
So, good news and bad news. The good news is that 13 years, 12 years after 9/11, you saw a resilience that was actually quite remarkable. Whatever the lessons of analysis show, the fact that a city as independent, it's where the Boston Tea Party was held, a city as fiercely independent as Boston actually complied with the request that people stay off the streets. We may well adjust that because it was actually a half hour after the quarantine, so-called, was lifted, that the second Tsarnaev terrorist was discovered shot up in a boat in Watertown. But the resilience was the first lesson. The second is we learned something about emergency response. 3 people were killed by the initial blast. No one who was hit by those pellets. Special place in hell for these 2, because they designed this pressure cooker with the kinds of pellets that were intended to actually do the kind of damage they did to many human torsos. Typically, people would bleed out, and you would have mass casualties. Not a single person, other than the 3 who were killed by the initial blast, actually died for 2 reasons. One is a fairly remarkable scene that is reflected in the newscasts and the videos of the scene. When the blast happened, people ran. They didn't run away. It was first responders, but also regular Bostonians actually ran toward the injured. And the tourniquets saved, and the presence of Boston medical facilities, but it was the tourniquets that actually saved lives. The cooperation between local and federal law enforcement, which was not terribly good 20 years ago when I first got into law enforcement, was superb. Superb in terms of the way in which the FBI worked with the Massachusetts State Police. not traditionally the greatest of friends, but they have built up a relationship and a modus operandi that served us well in a crisis. Third, actually the immigration processes. These were people who came in on asylum claims and were granted asylum. The two boys, the two terrorists, were then boys when they came in, and actually all of the paperwork was right. Lessons learned. Lessons learned. So in fact, we did share information between the intelligence agencies and law enforcement, but there was, we've gotten to the point where we have to be wary that it becomes a bureaucratic exercise. So the questions that we're looking at and will continue to examine is, what were the reactions to a 6-month stay in Dagestan? And how did people react to that? And how did you process the information given the fact that that was known? How did Customs and Border Protection at Logan Airport relate to those files? So, you know, a very somber, horrible event with reflections that, you know, confirm that I believe the American people know that we are not immune, and that the record of not a single bombing after 9/11 was a blessed period that was hard fought.
We got time for one more question.
Hello, Rachel Harris, one of the Future Partners. What's your thoughts on how hacking and cybersecurity, how's that going to affect the future of security?
So the notion of borders as flows is most aptly embodied and best reflected in cyber flows, in the notion of cybersecurity. And like I suspect in your country, in the last 18 months, we've started down the path. It's an extraordinary period, comparable in its own way to the post-World War II period, when nuclear weapons, there were no rules governing the theory, game theory on how nuclear weapons would be used. And we've developed an entire international regime, sometimes threatened to be ignored, but on how to handle nuclear weapons, the notions of deterrence. Cyber, we are basically in that period that we will look back 20 years from now, perhaps 5 years from now, and say, boy, that was a no man and no woman's land in which there were no rules about this. We couldn't, you know, we now find ourselves enlisting hackers to help us understand non-state actors and state actors. So yes, the implications of cyber for infrastructure protection, for the relationship between the private sector and the government, for the relationship between governments. You know, I've asked the question, what could be more inherently transnational than cyber? While you may want to preserve an offensive capability that is independent and national for deterrent purposes or otherwise, why in a defensive posture wouldn't we be working right from moment one with our closest friends and allies? But these are, again, you know, we're still operating in a world of flows. We're still governed largely by the lines of the Westphalian system of the 17th century, in which we look at this as national events rather than as transnational events, so that I think cyber will push us more and more toward arrangements that are more consistent and consonant with flows than the lines of traditional time. Thank you. Thanks.